All right. Great to see you all this morning. So we had a week off from Corinthians last week, and we had covered seven sermons. Take a week off, then we're going to cover seven more, then a week off, and then we'll finish with the final four. So I want to remind us, right, that the premise of this series of being different isn't just that Paul is pointing out to the Corinthian church that they need to be different and stand out from the culture in Corinth, but that we are approaching this letter in a different way as well, and that we also are saying that it is okay to have different doctrinal beliefs. That where we want to agree on, the one point we want to agree on is that Jesus is God. Is that Jesus was sent by the Father, that He lived a sinless life, that He lived and died and shed blood and rose again so that we could be made right with the Creator of the universe. And if we can agree on that, this is my premise. You don't have to agree with me, by the way, and I want to touch on that again in a minute. My premise is that if we can agree on that, you and I can agree on that, then all the other doctrines the church has come up with over the years, I'm okay if we think differently. Now, you may not agree with that, and that's the point I want to make, and I'm okay with that. Okay? Because what may be happening as we've gone through the first 7 weeks is you might be thinking to yourself, this guy's whacked. Or the way he's teaching this isn't anything I've heard. Or you know what? I don't even agree with how he's teaching that. And so a couple things. One, that's okay. Do we still agree that Jesus is God? Yes. And if you're struggling, man, please chat it up with me. Please come and say, I don't agree with you, but let's talk through this. Let's figure this out. Let's agree to disagree, whatever it might be. But let's not be like the Corinthians and begin to label each other. Right, that becomes the issue. That's the very issue we dealt with in the first 5 chapters of Corinthians, is where people began to label each other based on their wisdom and teaching, based on their beliefs, and began to create factions amongst one another. We do not want to be those people. Okay? And so I don't expect that as we go through this that you're going to be like, oh my gosh, he's the smartest guy I've ever met. This is so enlightening. I don't expect that. What I expect is that you're going to wrestle with Jesus. That you're going to wrestle with God as we bring different ideas to the text, okay? And that if you're struggling in that wrestling, that you're going to come into me and say, hey, Tim, can we talk through this a little bit? Because I don't either agree with you or I'm struggling to even understand what you're even saying, okay? And so that's our premise as we go in, as we continue this. Because now we get to this crazy chapter. Now, I don't know if you're reading ahead. I hope you're reading ahead and you're coming prepared each week, having read the text that I'm about to get into. But this is a crazy text. This is a text that the church has developed doctrine, very rule-based doctrines around, and said this is the way it's going to be. This is also a text, and I'll share examples of this, that I've seen the church abuse and cause harm to its congregants by using this text. And so I'm reading this text and I'm trying to understand it in the context of Paul, and we're gonna get to that, and I'm like, what the heck is going on? Now, what we want to remember is this congregation at Corinth is no bigger than us. This is a small group of people that Paul is calling out all of these behavioral issues in, okay? This isn't a congregation of thousands. This is a congregation of probably 50 people. And Paul's pointing out all of these different things. So I'm going to attack this a little different this morning. I'm going to give you an outline of the text. Here's where this text is going. Here's what Paul's saying from a very high level. Then we're going to jump back and we're going to start looking at it, because I'm not going to read 40 verses, by the way. We're going to then come back to the top and kind of work our way through it, talk through maybe how the church has abused it, talk through the context of what's even going on here, what is Paul even doing based on what he's been saying prior to this, and then arrive at a spot, as I have wrestled through this and sought God, arrive at a spot that I believe speaks truth for the church today. Okay? And again, as we wrestle through this, we're going to do this together. So let's take a quick look at the outline. So this is where Paul starts to answer the questions from the Corinthians in the letter they sent back to him. Now, if you're new to this study, Paul and the Corinthians aren't getting along. Okay? They're doing a little battle here because Paul planted this church, but they're starting to follow other leaders, and they're even saying to Paul, like, we don't even know if we want to follow you, and we don't even know if you're an apostle. Okay? So there's tension that exists, and Paul's written one letter, they've written one back, at least that we know of, and then this letter comes, and so we don't have the full story. But what we know here is Paul begins to answer their questions. So that's why I underlined verses 1 through 7. And so Paul answers a question. We'll get to that in a minute. So here's the basic outline of this very simply. To the married, and I want you to look for the common word in all of this. And we'll talk about that. It's not married. To the married, remain married. To the unmarried and widows, it's good to remain unmarried. To the married, where you both believe, remain married. To those married to an unbelieving spouse, remain married. What's the common word so far? Remain, yes. Then we're going to skip the middle section here. We'll get to that next. To the engaged, it's good to remain unmarried. This is where he addresses the second question. We'll get to that again. To the married women and widows, the married and bound to the married are bound to the marriage. When widowed, it's good to remain unmarried. Okay, so 1 through 16, 25 through 40, dealing with marriage, when that's not necessarily either of the two questions that were asked. Okay? In the middle of this, Paul throws in some sentences that have nothing to do with marriage. But when I read them in the context of what's going on here, I almost get the sense of this is the point. Yet the point deals with a situation that's very bizarre and it's just crazy. And we'll get to that. So verse 17 through 24, right in the middle of these two sections, Paul says what? Remain. Remain in the place you were at the time of your call, meaning at the time you came to say yes to Jesus. Remain in that place. Okay? We're going to come back to that. There's this great statement here. I want to read this and give us some more context because we need to understand Paul's thinking. For Paul, the one thing of eternal significance that humans can do in this world is to serve Jesus. That is center for Paul. Hopefully we've seen that in all that we've seen in Corinthians. For Paul, it's about the gospel. And it's about living out the gospel every day. Paul's not so narrow-minded that he thinks all of the Corinthians or anybody else who follows Jesus must become full-time missionaries like himself. But he does believe that all must bear witness in whatever social situation they find themselves with their lives and their words. So Paul believes that not everybody should follow his path, but that as a follower of Jesus, whatever situation I might be in, my life and my words should be a revelation of the gospel. That Jesus should be seen in me through my actions and my words. Okay, I like that. Right? I don't disagree with that. But here's the challenge of this text. Paul, he's in this Corinthians, about 25 years after Jesus has been resurrected, believes that Jesus' return is imminent. Paul believes, right up until the end of his life, based on most of his writings, that Jesus is coming back in his life. Paul believes that Jesus could come back tomorrow. And so if I believe that Jesus could return tomorrow, stop being focused on anything else and be focused on the gospel. That makes complete sense. Our struggle in that and our challenge in that is we're 2,000 years past that, and really, is he? We've lost the urgency of the imminent return of Christ. Right or wrong? And that's, by the way, that's a whole other sermon series. And as I've thought through that, I'm like, that could be this, but that's not this. That's not the point of this text, right? Is are we living like Christ could return tomorrow? That's a whole nother thought. Set that over there. But that helps us understand the context of why Paul would say remain, remain, remain. Okay? And so does this mean that 2,000 years later, Paul is speaking to us again to remain, to remain, to remain? So let's go all the way back. There we go. Turn to 1 Corinthians 7 if you're not there. So let's bring this into context, because the question that Paul's addressing fascinates me. And I know you're probably like, why does our pastor always have to talk about sex in church? But here we go again. Because when we started chapter 6, right, Paul started to deal with the behavior problems. And he says, hey, the guy in your church, in the body there, that's having sex with his stepmom, not a good deal. We don't even talk about the guy's dad. We don't know what happened, but no, this guy shouldn't be having sex with his stepmom. And then he goes down, he says, there's some other things going on. You're abusing each other with your mouths. You're abusing each other sexually. Okay. And then he gets down in the end, he said, stop going to the temple prostitutes. And so I don't know about you, but I read chapter 6, and I'm thinking this is an oversexed group of people. They got issues, right? Remember, there's 50 people. And I'm thinking to myself, like, oh, okay, Paul's trying to deal with all this sexual immorality within the church. And then we get to this question. Apparently, one guy at least writes to Paul and says this. Now, concerning the matters about which he wrote, Paul says, it is good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman. What? You've just been talking about how apparently these people are having a lot of sex with a lot of different people. But apparently there's one guy that's looking at it and saying, has written a question to Paul, or maybe two, I don't know, written a question to Paul and said, you know what? I'm not even sure I should have sex. Most scholars would translate this based on where Paul goes. I shouldn't have sex with my wife. What does that mean? Is this a guy that's saying, I'd rather go to the temple with the prostitutes? Or is this a guy that's saying, I think it's more holy for me if I just abstain completely within my marriage? And so we don't really know that. We try to grasp it based on the context of how Paul answers. Because now Paul goes on a large diatribe about marriage. And I'm sitting there, and again, if I'm reading this, like, one, I don't really understand the question based on what I've just read about what I thought was happening within this 50-person group, but there's someone that's got this issue, and so Paul wants to talk to them about marriage. Now, here's what I've seen, and we're not going to read it all, but we're going to step through each of the sections here in a minute. I've had people sit across from me in my office and say, in tears, my husband has been verbally abusing me for years, or he has even physically abused me, but my last pastor said, according to 1 Corinthians 7, I need to remain. I've had single people who've never been married, young people, come to me and say, my youth pastor told me that because of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says it's better to be unmarried. And so I really want to have a marriage. So does that mean I don't ever get married? I've had widows and widowers come to me and say, well, a pastor told me from 1 Corinthians 7 that it's just better for me to stay single, but I really would love to have a relationship again and be married. Does that mean I can't? And then people who have been divorced come to me and say, I was told that according to 1 Corinthians 7, I can never get married. And then people who are in jobs that they hate. My pastor said, I just need to remain. I need to gut it out, because do I believe God gave me the job? Yeah, then I just got to gut it out. Right? You get it how we can take something that maybe wasn't meant to be read the same way and take it so literally that it has no meaning to our current cultural or specific situations. Because then, we haven't even got to 17 through 24, because here, Paul says to the guy who's a slave, stay a slave because you're free in Jesus. What do you think of that? You all in support of slavery? Because Christians have used that passage to say, Paul supported slavery, so I guess I can have slaves. And when I read this, I'm like, I can't make a command out of the first part if I'm not going to make a command out of the slave part. I wrestle through that, right? You understand the struggle of Corinthians? It's easy to pick and choose the part that fits the part of the life or the model or the message I want to give and use it in that way. Instead of trying to find Jesus in 2025 in the text, in what Jesus might be saying to me about me in my life. So, this is a passage, oof. I had a guy call me, you're not going to believe this. This was God. A guy called me, a guy that he and I have wrestled with theology for years together. It's a beautiful relationship. And he was bringing up this passage of people he's dealing with in the church. He's not a pastor, but he's an elder dealing with divorcees. And we're talking about 1 Corinthians 7 and the rules the church even wants to put in place. And I'm like, oof, really? Really? Is that what this is about? Is that what this is about? So let's just step through a little bit of this. Are there good principles in here? Yeah. Paul says one thing is of the Lord. Okay, we'll get to that. Verse 10 and 11 says, this is the Lord. He's going back to Jesus from Matthew most likely, and even that context, right? But let's look at this. So Paul says to this guy, some guy's asking, hey, I want to be a holy guy. I want to abstain. We think. So Paul says, because apparently this is the only guy within a group of 50 that doesn't struggle with sexual morality, I don't know, but Paul says, you know what? But because of the temptation to sexual immorality. Wait a second, this guy is saying that he wants to have sex. But Paul says, because of this temptation, if you're married, give each other great conjugal rights. Treat each other with respect. Treat each other in the way you want to be treated. I have had men walk into my office and say, hey, it says here that I own my wife's body. And I'm like, did you read the next sentence? Did you read the whole passage? Yeah, but you know how it's supposed to be, and I'm in charge, and so I own her body, and she doesn't do it. Have you read it? Paul's saying we're in this together, and if you're married, stay married. Love each other, treat each other in the way you should within the marriage, submit to each other in that way. Verse 6. Fascinating. Look at verse 6 and 7. Now, as a concession, he says, I'm digressing here, but this isn't a command, but I wish that all were like me. I wish you're all like me, Paul says. Okay. Someone smack me if I say that. But each has his own gift from God, one of a kind and one of another. Paul said, I wish you could all be like me, staying single and fully devoted to God, but you can't be because God's given us all different gifts, which Paul's going to get to when we get to that part in Corinthians, by the way. So whatever your gift is, live it out for the Lord. Okay, so we know Paul's stance on being single, don't we? He's pretty clear. I wish you could all be like me. So Paul values singleness, and we're going to get to that here in a minute. And he says why he values singleness. Verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to remain single, but if you can't, if you can't control yourself, get married. For Paul, that's the only reason you get married, if you can't control yourself. You talk to Jesus about that. 10 and 11. To the married, Paul says, I give this charge. Well, it's not me. This is Jesus. And he says, if you're already married, don't separate, because Jesus already said that. That's another sermon. Okay, set that one over there. We'll get to that. And to the rest, Paul says, I say this. This isn't the Lord. That if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, stay. What's his point? Why? Because of the gospel. If Jesus is coming back tomorrow, or in the next week, or in the next month, stay. Why? Because this could be another soul won for Jesus. So stay. Stay. Doesn't necessarily talk about what staying might mean for the believing or the unbelieving spouse. Doesn't really talk about the struggle that might, no other context but stay. You know how many times I've had that one. My pastor told me to stay. And here's what he's doing. Or here's what she's doing. And it's abuse. Should I stay? Doesn't that what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7? So they can know Jesus? And then he gets to verse 17. which I think really gets at the heart of the matter, which I really feel like Paul does well, right? He's talking about these things, but then he gets at the heart of the matter. But his examples play, right? And this is my struggle with Scripture, and I'm telling you, I was going to be completely honest with you, is if you say what Paul said so far plays in the 21st century, you got to say what he says next plays in the 21st century. You can't pick out the part that you want to play and the part you don't want to play. Do you understand? So he says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, into which God has called him. That makes sense? I don't know about you, but I want to fulfill the calling God has placed on me. By the way, every one of you have a calling of the Lord. If you've said yes to Jesus, it's just not to mindlessly walk through life and say, oh, I'm just going to go to church on Sunday and life is good for me. No, it is to seek out what God has for you, using the gifts He has given you in the place He has planted you for now. Okay? Everyone has that responsibility. Not just a guy that's like, God's call to say, you got to be a pastor, right? It's not, no, all of us have that responsibility. So Paul says, well, this is the rule I give in all my churches. Thank you for that. That's good. So he essentially says then, if you're circumcised, and I don't know how you do this, don't get uncircumcised. I surely would agree with that one. And if you are not circumcised, don't worry about it. Okay. Win. Verse 20. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a slave when you were called? Now, I haven't even got into a long excursus on slavery in the Roman Empire. And maybe we'll get on that. But the bottom line is some people put themselves into slavery because they could have a better position than if they were in poverty. And that's a whole other story. But still, let's hear it. They're still a slave with a master who they have to be obedient to 100% of the time. Okay, so it's not like, hey, you're my slave, we're buddies. It's like you're going to do whatever I tell you to do. Okay, so we still want to make sure we get that. So Paul says, were you a slave? Don't be concerned. Well, I don't know what bad word comes into your mind when you read that, but a bunch come into my mind. Are you kidding me? This passage has been used throughout history by Jesus followers to say it must be okay to have slaves. And by the way, Mr. Slave of mine, I hope you get to know Jesus and be free in Him as I lord myself over you. But know that you're free in Him. You understand the challenge of being literal here? But if you gain your freedom, Mr. Slave, go for it. For he who was called in the Lord as a slave is a freedman in the Lord. Man, that reads nice. To be free in the Lord is nice. I'm free in the Lord, but to be held in bondage by another human, you understand the challenge. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Man. Yes. But no. Yes, there are situations where God is asking me to remain. And there are situations where God is telling me to flee. Am I in touch enough with God to know the difference? Which I think really begins to get at Paul. In all that he's been saying, right? If we go back and review 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, Paul is like, it's about the gospel, man. It's about Jesus. Stop labeling other people. Stop following people. Stop saying this person's wise and that person's wise, and focus on the wisdom of the cross. Focus on what Jesus did. Which leads me back to this quote I shared last week, which I think gets at, or 2 weeks ago, the heart of this, which is more challenging than being rule followers. The Corinthian problem was not with their experience of the Spirit. We're going to find out. Maybe they experienced the Spirit. Paul talks about it prior to this, right? He's like, man, you all saw the power. But with their misunderstanding of what it meant to be spirit people. Their misunderstanding of what it meant to be followers of Jesus. Their misunderstanding of what it meant to say yes to Jesus and no to the world. Yes to where Jesus was leading and no to where he wasn't. Yes to remain when I needed to remain and no when I wanted to go. Yes to when Jesus says flee and no when I want to remain. And then he goes on right in the rest, and he says more, and we already summarized those verses about who's to remain married and who's not to remain married. But if I think about this, I'm thinking about what God is speaking to me, and maybe you're hearing something else, but what I hear God say to me, to say to you, is be spirit people. Be Jesus followers. I think the church would prefer rules because we can control that better, we can measure that better. We can hold each other accountable better when we say this is A, this is B, this is C, yes, yes, no, 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 yes, right? But when I say be a spirit person, that means God is going to use the uniqueness of every single one of us unique creatures in a unique way. In the giftings He has given us in ways we may never have imagined, and He's going to take all of us unique, broken, struggling, messed up, intelligent, joyful, sad, depressed, anxious people and put us together to live the gospel together. That can get ugly and uncomfortable. It's easier to say everyone in my body needs to look like this. So how do you be a spirit person? How do you be a Jesus follower and know whether you should remain? Know whether you should flee? Know whether you should change? Know whether you should befriend? Know whether you should submit? How do you know that? Again, I don't think this is complex. You already know. The question becomes, are we willing to every day, every week at least, but every day say to Jesus, what do you got for me today? Where are you taking me today? What do you want with me today? You see why you know why we don't like to ask that question? Because we really like the comfort of our lives. We really like, well, some of us do, most of us do. We like where we're planted. We like, maybe we like this situation, we like that situation, maybe we like our job, we like this. And so if I really ask, He might ask me to change. He might ask me to go a different direction. He might ask me to do something different. He might ask me to befriend my enemy. He might ask me to love someone who is diabolically different than me. He might ask me to befriend someone who's politically opposite. He might ask me to befriend someone who's theologically opposite. He might you get what I'm saying? When we're spirit people and we are going to say yes to Jesus and be His followers, then we need to be at the whim of wherever He wants to lead us as individuals and wherever He wants to lead us as a body. And I don't know about you, but that's uncomfortable. When I consult the Lord for everything in my life and give Him dominion over everything in my life and say, I want to be where you want me to be. I want to be whom you want me to be. I want to be engaged with those you want me to be engaged with, right? Whatever it might be. It says I'm not in control and He is. And Paul is saying to this upstart church, and as we're gonna see as we continue to go through this, he's just trying to get them to understand what it means to follow Jesus. And by the way, 2,000 years later, we're still trying to figure it out. We're still trying to figure it out. And by the way, if one of you has it figured out, please see me after so I can tell you haven't. So we're in this together. If you're a person that has been hurt by someone because they took something in 7 and laid it upon you, forgive them. Forgive them. If you're a person that has hurt someone because you've laid something from 7 upon them, seek the Lord's guidance. I've used this in the past to hurt. Our goal isn't in this to say we've figured it all out. You get that, right? I'm way past that in my life. I don't have it figured out. Never had. Thought I did at times. Our goal, Paul's goal, I believe, Paul's heart, is that we can understand the gospel. And the gospel is transforming and life-changing. And then the more I embrace the gospel never gets old. As a matter of fact, a seminary professor told me that when you preach a sermon, if half the people don't walk out with a stomach ache, you have not preached the gospel. And I'm like, oof, I don't know if I'm preaching the gospel enough. I'm not sure there's enough stomach aches in here. Because the gospel is rough. What Jesus has called us to is challenging. Well, I will agree with Paul, it does bring freedom to be who He has created us to be as we figure out what He has for us. There's much challenge for us as we continually walk through this, right? And as we continually go through what Paul says, and in the next couple chapters are kind of interesting as Paul continues to get back into things, but man, we're going to jump into the whole women thing here shortly. I can't wait for that one, right? Because church is split on that question and what women can and can't do, so we're going to be into that and how women should dress when they come to church and all those things. Doesn't that sound like fun? But again, here's my premise on this whole thing. I can't read 5 verses literally and throw the rest out. If I'm a literalist, I got to read it all literally. Or none, and try to figure it out along the way. So as Betsy's going to come, and we're going to sing a great song to start, because this is really the point, right? Give me Jesus. We all need Jesus. We all want to know Jesus. We should all desire to know Him in a deeper way. But after that, we're going to continue singing what really needs to be my anthem, Take My Life and Let It Be. Take my life and let it be. Let's pray. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus, for transforming me, for changing me, for giving me purpose, for giving me life in the present, and giving me life in the future. But I pray that your Spirit would continually flow freely amongst us. I pray that your Spirit would continually descend upon us. I pray that we would be drawn nearer to Jesus, nearer to you every moment of every day. And in that, we will be drawn closer to one another. Lord, may we be a body that is different. May we be a body that is different because of you and you alone.